projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 12, a cinematic Beau-nanza, in which my guest and I will be discussing his latest book, which documents the multimedia incarnations of a classic adventure novel.
Company, attention!
What on earth ever prompted you to join the Legion?
Well, you see, Brigadier, it was like this. I came here to help him forget.
Forget? Forget what?
Well. I forgot.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. Before I introduce my guest, I want to do something that I normally reserve for the end, just in case any of you tend to rush to the exits as I'm winding down. First, I should remind any of you newbies to hit the follow or subscribe button, depending upon where you listen, so that none of the upcoming episodes slip by. The ultimate success of this podcast and its longevity will be greatly impacted by its appearance in the podcast rankings. Of course, that's based on the number of downloads it gets. And the number of downloads it gets will be greatly aided by those of you who listen and enjoy it, leaving a rating and review wherever you listen. Now, my understanding is that leaving a review is actually only an option with Apple Podcasts. However, you can still leave a review in the form of comments on the Movie Nights and Matinees website or on the Facebook page. Those will still be helpful because I can use your kind words to entice potential sponsors. Beyond that, it's really just a matter of spreading the word, which I hope you'll do. You can also more directly help sustain the podcast financially by ordering books or videos through the Amazon links found on the website's bookshelf and screening room pages, respectively, or by ordering some Movie Nights and Matinees swag through the memorabilia link. Any and all of it is helpful and very much appreciated. Now to the business at hand. I have a feeling that in the next edition of Webster's Dictionary, if you look up the word comprehensive, you'll find a photo of the cover of the latest book by today's guest. Although he's authored some 45 books, this is clearly one of his most massive accomplishments. And there are 456 pages to back me up on that. The book is The Compleat Beau Geste, which if anything is an understatement. And here to talk about it and its voluminous contents is Frank Thompson, who once upon a time was a podcaster himself. His podcast, The Commentary Track, is full of extensive interviews that frankly, no pun intended, okay, maybe a little, put me to shame. I confess to being humbled by the fact that many of his subjects are names that are unfamiliar to me. However, there are some who will be immediately known to classic movie buffs, as well as a few who may be familiar, but whom you wouldn't tend to associate with older films. Anyhow, the Commentary Track podcast is well worth seeking out, and I'm very happy to have its creator join me today, as I fake being as well informed as he is. Frank, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's great to be here.
You know, one of the approaches that I've taken to set my podcast apart from other movie-oriented podcasts is that instead of doing a deep dive into one movie at a time, I want to have a broader approach covering entire genres, movie series, and so forth. Episode 10 was an anomaly for a number of reasons. However, while at first glance, this episode might seem to be focusing on a single film, that's far from the case. So how about giving us kind of a dust jacket synopsis of what the book covers?
It covers everything related to this subject. All the adaptations of P.C. Wren's 1924 novel, Beau Geste. There are films. There's a TV miniseries. There are 3 connected plays. There are comic books. There are toys. I have galleries of book covers and posters, and I even cover the sequels, the film versions of Beau Sabreur and Beau Ideal, which in itself had a remake in Mexico called Hermoso Ideal that was made in 1947. And it's all there. This is an exhaustive thing. Not my biggest book, by the way. That was a book I co-wrote with John Gallagher called Nothing Sacred, The Cinema of William Wellman, which weighed in at about 700 pages and more than 1,300 pictures.
Wow.
It's
Okay.
it's massive. But this, I did it all by myself, so it's not quite as massive. But this was definitely a COVID project because I had, I've spent most of my life just picking up things related to the subject as I went along, and with no idea really of what to do with it. And then when lockdown came, I decided I'd better get to it, figuring I would finish it in 6 months. In fact, it took me more than 3 years. And that was 3 years of mostly 7-day weeks of further research and writing. And it was a massive project, but it was the perfect lockdown project to me.
Well, yeah, it shows. I mean, as you say, it's astonishing to see the variety, not just the quantity, but the variety of illustrations that are in it. The things that you say, all the pictures of, well, I mean, sheet music, posters, toys.
They're frame grabs from Gilligan's Island. Come on.
Oh, I don't know. I think I might have missed that, but that.
And The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, there was that episode. That's true. Yeah, I mean, and as you say, it's like anything that it touches is documented in there, and it's staggering, but it's also extremely cool. Okay, so the obvious question is, what was your introduction to Beau Geste?
I saw it on TV when I was about 12. And more than that, I saw only the last half of it on TV. And it just so happened that my mother walked into the room. It was a Sunday afternoon and asked me what I was watching. And I said, boy, this is a terrific movie. And she said, oh, I think there's a book of that. And so the next day I went to the school library and asked my librarian if there was a book called Beau Geste. And she said, yeah, we have it, and showed it to me. And it had movie stills in it, but it wasn't the movie I had seen. It was from the Ronald Colman film. So that immediately set me off in, I've always called it the big bang of my movie life. And I hasten to add, it's not that I thought that Beau Geste was the greatest movie I'd ever seen. It just immediately made me start making connections that never stopped. From that, I went on to Morocco and then found out who Marlene Dietrich was. And, just one thing after another. And
so it planted the seed.
Yeah, it was also that the universe seemed to make me more interested in it because it was within a year period of when I saw it at 12, that Gilligan's Island episode came on where they parody Beau Geste, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which was called the Beau Geste Affair when it was first released, but then Universal made them change it to the Foreign Legion Affair.
Permit me to review the facts. You both jumped from a plane you had chartered because two men changed places with a pilot and co-pilot and were about to kill you. Correct?
Correct.
Then this young lady made a burnoose out of the parachute because all your clothes were taken from you. After that, you both decided to walk to Marrakesh, which happens to be a little over 300 kilometers away. In other words, with the entire Sahara Desert at your disposal, you just happened to be passing in the vicinity of this fort.
Yes, sir. I didn't know it was a restricted...
Renegade! Liar! You take me for a fool!
Then I got, right at that same time, got word that they were remaking it with Doug McClure and Guy Stockwell and so forth. So it was just like one thing after another that just kept bringing it into my life. It was the weirdest thing.
Yeah, you mentioned you alluded to the Ronald Colman, and that makes me want to point out that although I guess the largest single section in the book is devoted to that 1939 Gary Cooper adaptation, that is probably the one people are most familiar with for a number of reasons. I guess because of that, that's the one I'm probably least interested in talking about, because I like, treading new ground. And the 1926 production was silent with Ronald Colman. And of course, Neil Hamilton was also in that, whom people of my generation mainly think of, him, Neil Hamilton, Commissioner Gordon on Batman.
Sure.
But now, I guess before we get into the various incarnations of it, maybe another thumbnail is called for. This time, just a general story synopsis, what the basic story is about and the characters we're going to be talking
It's
about.
a fairly simple story in that it's a mystery about three British brothers, in the films sometimes more British than at other times, who have a family jewel which disappears one night. And because it threatens to cause great scandal to their family, they each take the blame for it. And because the groundwork has been laid for them to be fascinated with the Foreign Legion, they all go and join the Foreign Legion to take suspicion away from the other people in their family and their aunt who has raised them and who is like a mother to them. Then they end up in this hellish desert fort with a martinet, a really cruel sergeant who is also a brilliant tactician. And I think the thing that most people remember from the plot line of the film, or the most memorable aspect, is that during the big battle with the Arabs, every time one of the legionnaires is killed, the sergeant props him back up in his embrasure, puts his rifle back in his hand, and to the Arabs who don't have field glasses or anything, it looks like they just keep replenishing their supplies at all. Apparently not noticing that the gunfire goes down very quickly, but it works. And luckily for them, there's exactly the number of embrasures in the fort that there are men. So that works out just fine.
Yeah, well, it probably also helps that they seem to be attacking from one side constantly.
They get all around, but in the Wellman film, it does seem to appear that they're coming straight at the gate. But in the Herbert Brennan version, it's a little bit more. In fact, in one scene in the Herbert Brennan version, they're actually circling the fort in a manner reminiscent of Indians going around a wagon train, in circles.
And just to further clarify now, when you say the Brennan version, Herbert Brennan, he directed the silent 1926 one with Ronald Colman. William Wellman directed the 1939 talkie with Gary Cooper. So when those are referred to, that's where we're going with that.
And Brennan got back to it with Beau Ideal in 1931, one of his first sound films. Not his first, but one of his first.
Right. And then the one in between then was also a silent. And that was
Beau Sabreur.
Yes.
And that was also with Gary Cooper. And William Powell's in all these things. It's just amazing. Because Paramount was on a real budget-minded situation at the moment in 1926 and 27. So they decided to make Beau Sabreur with Gary Cooper in the Guadalupe Dunes, which is where famously Cecil B. DeMille made the Ten Commandments 3 years earlier or so. And Bibi Daniels was going to make a Foreign Legion Arab comedy called She's a Sheik. And so Paramount just said, we have sets, we have all the costumes, just take Bibi Daniels to Guadalupe Dunes and just make it there. So made on precisely the same place. And I found some stills from each film showing them in exactly the the same locations.
And Beau Sabreur, that was another silent.
Yeah.
And that one's lost, except for the trailer. Is that correct? Am I remembering correctly?
The trailer exists. You could, I've found bits and pieces of it in several places. There's a 1932 Smith and Dale short called Arabian Shrieks, and it has footage from Beau Sabreur in it, as well as the 26 Beau Geste, just to pad out the comedy. And She's a Sheik exists in part in a print in England. And the climax of that film has these creative cameramen. During an Arab attack, they start showing movies of foreign legionnaires attacking the Arabs. And the Arabs buy this completely. But all that footage was from Beau Sabreur.
Yeah, and they project it onto the dunes.
Onto the dunes,
yeah. Okay.
And they reverse it. They have when they're getting up to a romantic scene, they quickly. Luckily, Kevin Brownlow saw it and wrote down much of the dialogue from the title cards. And so it's funny to know that William Powell and all the other evil Arabs are going, what? They're all running backwards now. What are they, devils? So pieces of Beau Sabreur are in at least 3 different places that we know, but the film itself gone.
Now, going back to the original, the 26 version, there were some really interesting things in your chapter about that one. One being just the way they set up the production in the desert, and this was near the Mexico border, wasn't it? And am I remembering
near
correctly?
The Mexican and the Arizona border.
Right.
Many people say it was made in Arizona, but it was not.
And they called it Camp Paramount, and it was apparently set up and run much like a military camp.
Yeah, that was Brennan's doing. I guess he thought things would run a lot more smoothly that way. So they had a raising of the flag ceremony. Everybody came out and stood in formation before they marched or rode up the dunes to the fort to shoot. It was a massive thing, really a huge camp. And it had all the amenities. It had, a movie theater and all kinds of game tents and everything. So it was fun and grueling at the same time, I guess.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, and in fact, you talk about some of the hardships that they ran into, including sickness and even smallpox at one point.
Yeah. It's interesting to read the production manager, Frank Blunt, who was interviewed at great length, also by Kevin Brownlow in 1970, I think. And he is always the hero of his own story. And everything he says is much bigger than. So we know from Brennan, who would also toot his own horn, he said maybe there were 5 or 6 cases of smallpox, and they needed to make sure that nobody knew about this, because if they got quarantined, everybody there would be stuck and not be able to get to their next jobs and all that. So they paid off a lot of people. He bribed a lot of people. But Frank Blunt always, he would say, there were 600 of them in the, there might have been 6. But, and he talks about one guy trying to get away and he's firing his pistol at him to make him stop. It's all a very exciting and completely made up story.
Mm-hmm. Well, another story that doesn't sound like it was made up and I got a kick out of was when the $10 bonus that was offered to the horsemen.
That is apparently a true story. I'll tell you the caveat of that. The story is basically all the mounted Arabs, and there were hundreds of them for this big scene. Depending on who you believe, Herbert Brennan either yelled it just before the shot started or let them know it before they all got together. And he basically said, there's a $10 bonus for anybody who gives me a good horse fall once the firing starts from the fort. And so these hundreds of horsemen come, the firing starts, every one of them falls off their horses. It's like 800-900 guys from 12 legionnaires still living in the fort. They just wipe them out. And Neil Hamilton told it all the time, but Neil Hamilton was not in Fort Zindernef. He was not. He was on the set, and so I believe that he might have seen it, but he always told it as though Ronnie and I were on the wall, and and he always said Ronald Colman just went into fits of laughter when this happened, and that every time they tried it over again, he would break up and it ruined the take and all that. Also, unbelievable story, because that entire scene is shot from their backs as the Arabs are coming toward them, and so all we're seeing is the legionnaires' backs. And if Ronald Colman started laughing, who cares? It doesn't make it. He would have to turn around and face the camera laughing, and I doubt seriously that he did that. But the basic part of the story is absolutely true. It was reported in a lot of the trade magazines and newspapers and so forth. So I believe it.
And there was just one little tidbit. You never know what you'll learn just in the periphery of the things that are recounted in books like this. But for instance, I never knew that horses and camels hate each other.
I don't guess I ever knew that either. but it comes up a lot. In the making of Beau Sabreur, there was a lot of trouble with horses and camels. I think it was B.B. Daniels got thrown off a horse one time because it got too close to a camel, and she was slightly injured, not bad, but she was. So who knew?
Yeah, it's like, four-legged Hatfields and McCoys or something.
Yes,
seems odd.
And in the Wellman film, there's lots of stills of Gary Cooper on a camel, but there's not a camel in that movie. So,
and then Beau, I know I'm going to mispronounce it here. I mean, just basic, regular.
You can say
meat.
ideal.
I mean, it looks like, Beau ideal, but it's
ideal.
Okay.
I always believe what the title is when somebody in the film says it, when somebody says the phrase.
Yeah.
Then I think, okay, that's how you pronounce it. So,
yeah, that makes sense. And that one was a talkie. Am I remembering correctly that that's the one that is kind of the least well regarded of the three?
Well, it is by me. I am not a critic, and I don't like reviews, and I don't review things. And I didn't want to impose my qualitative point of view in this book. That was not interesting to me. It's not my business whether you like it or not. I don't want to steer you. But Beau Ideal is so notably terrible that I thought there was no way of discussing it without that. There are scenes in it that are just unbelievably inept. And yet there are some a lot of the location stuff is really impressive. And they did these long shots with sound, recording sound at the same time, these long tracking shots across the sand dunes when they had put down plank roads. And when you think about it, that's really impressive, using the huge cameras and the sound equipment and everything they had at the time. That was really an achievement. But boy, oh boy, the film is terrible.
Yeah, I've seen the first portion of it on YouTube. It's there, as is the silent, the 1926 Beau Geste.
Terrible print too.
Yeah. But the opening scene in Beau Ideal, I mean, it's, I don't know. It was like lights, camera, overact.
Yeah.
It's gone mad. Poor devil. It's the madness of the desert. The heat. The awful heat. Oh, why doesn't this madness come to me?
For 6 days now, they haven't brought our rations. Why? Why? They never come. Why don't they bring them? Oh, Madre de Dios, help me. Don't let me die in this grave. Let me die above ground.
And that apparently was Brennan's aim. The main character in the film is played by Lester Vale, who made very little impact on the world of film, but it was originally cast as being played by Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And Brennan and Fairbanks had real problems from the start, and I think it can only be because he wanted them to act like that. And Fairbanks just had this natural, easy way, even in 1930. He just had this charming, subtle manner, and I just think he balked at it, so he finally left. They said that he had been cast in another film that Howard Hawks wanted him, and they always do stuff like that. But others in the trades just saying, a lot of fireworks on the set with Brennan and Fairbanks. So then he brings in Lester Vale, who apparently was glad to do whatever he wanted. It's terrible.
Yeah.
But I will say, in addition to that brilliantly shot scene on the desert, there's a massive battle scene at the end with hundreds and hundreds of people in this. They built this huge set, in the old RKO lot in the valley. But it's big, really big. And so that's pretty impressive. If I were making a documentary and I just showed you select clips from that film, you'd think it was terrific. Because there are scenes that seem like it.
Well, if I can find the time, maybe I'll make myself get through the rest of it.
I'm not saying it's worth it, but it's, at least on YouTube, you can fast forward.
Oh, that's true. All right. So, and keeping the chronology now. Okay. So the original silent Beau Geste, that's 26. Beau Sabreur is what year?
27.
27. Okay.
But it didn't come out till 28 because it was massively reshot. As a matter of fact, it was reshot by Clarence Badger, who spent as much time shooting the reshoot as John Waters, the original director, filmed the original production. So they must have just redone every single shot in the film.
Wow.
But we'll never know. I mean, we have no idea. It did really good business, and I found lots of reports in the paper saying how many people they turned away at this theater and that theater, and that it was mobbed. And I think it was much more popular than you would think, but as far as we know, it's been lost for years.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if that ever turns up. All right. And then Beau Ideal, and that was which year was that?
31.
31. Okay. So then there's a pretty significant gap before the remake, the 1939.
Yeah.
With Gary Cooper, the William Wellman production. And I guess there were a few false starts leading up to that one actually going into production in terms of casting and just general.
Yeah, it's a real journey from when it first came into somebody's mind to do it, because all different kinds of people were cast. It was going to be George Raft. It was going to be Fred McMurray.
Do you remember Paul Muni's name being thrown in there too at some point?
I think he might have been considered. I don't know if he actually ever went to it, but Akeem Tamaroff was listed, and just a lot of people. And Henry Hathaway was going to shoot it in Technicolor, and Victor Fleming was on it for a very brief time. And
yeah, he didn't do anything in 1939.
No, nothing of note. That's for sure. A lazy guy. He really accomplished nothing. But Gary Cooper was always in the cast. First time they start talking about cast, Gary Cooper is the lead, and he was always there. So all these other people, Fred McMurray and all these, were going to be the other brothers.
Yeah.
And as incongruous as that sounds, I'm of the opinion that Fred McMurray is one of the greatest screen actors ever. So I know he could have done it. I know he could have. But and Ray Milland was cast pretty early on, so he was pretty much always there. David Niven really wanted it badly, and Goldwyn would loan him out. On and on and on. The interesting thing to me, and I didn't know this, I've written so much about this film over the years because I've done 2 books about Wellman and I've done all this other stuff, but I never found this out until I was writing this, is that J. Carrol Naish was cast as the Sergeant Markoff. And right at the last minute, they decided that Brian Donlevy would do it.
I am Sergeant Markoff. I make soldiers out of scum like you, and I don't do it gently. You're the sloppiest looking lot I've ever seen. It's up to me to prevent you from becoming a disgrace to the regiment, and I will prevent that if I have to kill half of you with work. But the half that lives will be soldiers. I promise you.
And then J. Carrol Naish got bumped down to his toady, Razanoff.
Yeah.
I think, J. Carrol Naish also terrific in every way, so he could have done it. But I never knew that.
Well, and another thing that I found interesting too was that William Wellman apparently had been a Legionnaire.
Yeah. He wanted to be a flyer, like many young Americans. Before America went into World War I, he joined first the Norton Harges Ambulance Corps as a way to get into the Lafayette Flying Corps because he wanted to be a flyer. But the only way you could be in that, which is a French outfit, was to join the Foreign Legion. So he was not a Legionnaire in the sense that Gary Cooper is in Beau Geste, but nevertheless, he was, and as far as I can tell, the only director who ever made any Beau Geste-related film who was actually a Foreign Legionnaire himself.
Well, that's an impressive badge to be wearing.
Yep.
Now, I first learned of this actually before getting my hands on your book, because I heard you on another podcast, I don't know, a couple of months ago or something, and talking about this. And this was my introduction to the 1940 version
Yes.
of Beau Geste. I'd never heard about this, and I imagine that most people listening have never heard about this. So tell us about that.
I don't think you can imagine how exciting that was for me to discover. Or maybe you can, but I was in San Diego trying to find some information on an Alamo film that was made in 1926. The press from that film called With Davy Crockett at the Fall of the Alamo with Cullen Landis. And I was trying to nail down any kind of location information. I couldn't find anything. But while I was going through these newspaper files, here's this 1939 article about these kids from San Diego State, which was a college then, a university now, who had made this parody of Beau Geste. And they made it because one of them had been working with his father in El Centro. And during spring break, he was taking water out to the fort while the Wellman film was being made. And in the summer, he went back to work with his father. And he thought, I'm going to drive out there and see if that fort's still there. And it was.
The fort from Beau Geste was still out there in the Yuma Desert. And as soon as we heard that, we said, well, we should make a movie.
And so they had this fort, and Paramount's fort. And so one of their grandmothers made uniforms, and they just took off and made several trips. None of them ever agreed on how many times they went out there, because they all remembered it slightly differently. But it could have been 6 or 8 times, maybe more. But they would just live in the fort. They would take sleeping bags and just shoot it. And then when they shot the battle scenes, they would put on the Arab robes and they would go out and they would attack the fort. And then when they were legionnaires, they would shoot themselves running across the dunes. The tragedy is, I kick myself about a lot of things in life, but this I come back to a lot. It really bothers me. I found out about it, I would say 5 years before I started trying to find people who were in it. And if I had gotten right on it, I could have found 3 or 4 more of them. And man, it kills me that, as a matter of fact, this is a horrible story. And so I'll tell you,
Perfect.
There was a guy named Bill Tasher who was in it. A very funny guy. Really, you could tell he had just personality plus, one of those guys. And he took his camera there, God bless it, because there are no pictures that Bill Tasher didn't take. I found 60 photographs that he took on the set. Somebody told me he was dead. And so I kept looking for his obituary and, trying to find out if there was any other information, or maybe he had children that had some stuff or something. And then one day I found his obituary and he had died a week earlier. And I couldn't believe it. It was before I'd finished the documentary, but it was a couple of years after I found the other guys, and he'd been living in Pasadena. I was living in North Hollywood. I could have gotten to his house in a half an hour, less.
Yeah.
So it just kills me. That's what happens when you wait too long to do something.
Yeah. And now you mentioned, I was going to bring this up, but so you've made a documentary about that production.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
In 2012. And if you think nobody has ever seen or heard of that film, you can also say that nobody has ever seen or heard of my documentary, except I had a Kickstarter campaign. And so the people who gave to that have the copies, and I have one DVD of it, and that's all there is.
So it has not received any kind of distribution?
None at all.
Oh, so we're just teasing the crap out of the listeners right now with this,
yes.
that this exists.
Let me tell you about the most fascinating film that there's no way in the world you can see.
Yeah.
Unless you come to my house and I'll show it to you. So,
well, how about the actual film, the 1940, that parody version? Does that survive at this point?
The thing, there are stories. It'll take too long to tell. The short version is, the dramatic crunch of the story is that Paramount found out that they had been using the fort, and that they had made, and they called the movie Beau Geste. Why they did because Bob Wade, who co-wrote it, wanted to call it Bo Peep or Bow Legs or several other options. And if they had, they would have had no trouble. But Paramount wrote to them and said, you can't show this film. They finally bargained with them and said, can we show it at least, a couple of times? And so Paramount said, yeah, show it 3 times and then burn it. So the first time I was on the phone with Bob Wade, who was the co-actor, co-writer, co-director, everything, he and H. Billy Miller, the first time I was on the phone, I said, it's so sad about the film that you had to burn it. He said, oh, we didn't burn it. You want a copy? So I said, no, I don't. Leave me alone. Shut up.
Yeah, sure you did.
But if this is interesting to anybody, Bob Wade and H. Billy Miller, who made this film and did virtually all parts of it themselves, were a writing team for the rest of their life. Billy Miller died fairly young in the early 60s, but they wrote many mystery novels, including Badge of Evil, which Orson Welles made a touch of evil.
Mm-hmm.
So there are Beau Geste connections. And Orson Welles, of course, made a radio version of Beau Geste, too. So wheels within wheels.
Yeah. And incidentally, that's something that you cover in the book as well, which maybe goes without saying just because of the explanation you gave. But yeah, there are chapters that cover radio adaptations, stage adaptations, pretty much anything connected to it.
Yeah.
So you did then manage to get a copy of that film, right?
I begged him for it. Yeah. And all he had was a VHS copy, which he gave me. And it's terrible. I'll tell the story, and I won't name any names because I don't need to embarrass anybody in public. But and this is also a really long story, which I won't tell. But we were down there. We went back to his house after his death, and I showed the documentary to his widow, who was a wonderful, wonderful woman. And I fibbed a bit. I said, Bob told me the last time he saw the print of the film, it was in the garage. Do you mind if I look in the garage? And she said, of course, let me go move the car out of it. And so we crawled all over up in the rafters and and I get back and my wife was with me and we are covered in dirt and dust and spider webs. And I'm standing there and I said to my wife, I really thought we found it. I thought it was going to be here. And she pointed at the floor and literally there was a paper bag next to my foot with the 16 millimeter print of the film in it.
Oh, wow.
Not only the 16 millimeter print of that film, but of the next film they made in 1941 called King Congo, which they shot in color.
Hmm.
But here's the story that'll break your heart, and it breaks my heart every time I hear about or think about it. I contacted a friend of mine who worked in an archive, which will be nameless, and said, I found this against all odds. I found these 2 16 millimeter prints. It's amazing. It's a miracle. I said, can you take them to the archive and see if there's, can you at least keep them in storage until we can figure out if there's any way to copy them or if they're too far gone or what? So we did. And then months passed. And then with me constantly, so what's going on with the film? And eventually he just finally wrote to me and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't know where they are.
Oh, boy.
I said, what do you mean you don't know where they are? And he said, they were in my garage. I said, in your garage? And so they're gone. I had the 60 millimeter prints of both of those films in my house for one day.
Wow.
And they're gone. So I'm telling you nothing but awful stories. So the next one will be happy, I promise.
Yeah. I don't remember where in the chronology this comes, but the discovery of those original remnants of the set, when that's discussed, when did that happen?
I mean, when I went there, when I found them?
Yeah.
I think the first visit was in 2009.
Okay.
Just by my friend who was a real location guy like I am, and he has a real fondness for Beau Geste as well. And one day we just said, we should go see if we can find it. And we got surrounded by the Border Patrol at one point. And the first day we couldn't find it at all. And then we just went back to the hotel and just kept looking at Google Earth and tried to find where it might be. And this very nice man with a dune buggy who was just out there to play with his dune buggy. We met him the first day we were there, and he drove us out. Very nice. So the next day we went out, and he was there, and he took us up to where we thought it might be. And the ground was covered with blank shells, thousands of them. And they were all Lebel rifle shells like the Foreign Legion used. Also, big piles of rocks everywhere, which at first we just thought, well, we're in the desert and there's piles of rocks. But it wasn't piles of rocks, it was the fort. A man from Yuma had contracted with Paramount to tear down the fort, move all the junk out of the desert because that was government land. And what he very clearly did was bulldozed it and covered it up with sand. And so when we get there 75 years later, whenever it was, the sand was blown off of it, and there were these huge piles of rock. You pick up each one, and there's, chicken wire on the back and, carved places where you would attach it to slats and so forth. It's astonishing. So, I kept trying to go back and get all the pieces so we could rebuild the fort, but that seemed impractical in some way.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. And as I recall in the book, you indicated that one of the reasons it was destroyed when it was to make sure that, the college guys didn't do a sequel or something like that.
No, I don't think, I have no idea when it came down. I've never been able to find out when it was torn down. The college guys came in Thanksgiving weekend of 1939. So Paramount had left in the previous March. In the summer, the guy who was contracted to take it down said it was too hot, and I'm sure it was. I made 6 trips to the location, I think, but we would always get there at sunup, and we'd almost always be gone by 9 a.m. because even in good times of the year, it could get horrible. So he just didn't do it. But one guy wrote to me years ago that was from Yuma and had relatives in Yuma. And he said he remembered in the 50s driving by on Highway 8 and seeing the fort in the distance. I don't know if I believe that it was up that long. It doesn't make any sense that it was, but people tell you things, so you believe them until you can disprove them.
Yeah. Well, we got a couple of questions I want to ask here, and I don't know that they're really going to flow into each other, but just jumping forward a bit to the 1966 production. You mentioned Doug McClure, and there were a number of famous names in that: Telly Savalas, Leslie Nielsen. I found it interesting that X Brands was in it as one of the Legionnaires who I had interviewed. He's probably best known for having played Pahu on the show Yancey Derringer.
Absolutely. Yeah. So good. Yeah. Character people, Leo Gordon and Michael Constantine.
Right. Vic London, who,
a bunch of
sci-fi
good people.
Fans will know immediately is Robinson Crusoe on Mars. But there were significant differences in that. Now, I was really interested to see it because it was written and directed by Douglas Hayes, and I had really liked some of his work that I had seen.
Sure.
He was basically the creator of the show Bearcats in the early 70s with Rod Taylor and Dennis Cole. I really enjoyed that one. Didn't last long. The Saturday morning cartoon based on it lasted longer than Bearcats lasted. And then he also directed, I don't know if he wrote and directed, but the first regular episode of the Night Gallery series, an episode called The Dead Man, which I don't think they ever excelled in the entire series. I don't think they ever got better than that.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. That was a terrific show.
And in any case, that made me really want to see it. So as I watched it, I'm trying to kind of put aside my thoughts of the 1939 classic which I just recently rewatched to refresh my memory, and tried to take it on its own terms. And I guess on its own terms, I thought it was a decent film. There are significant changes to the not only the storyline but the characters, who's there, who isn't. What are your thoughts on that one?
I've always liked it. I've always enjoyed it. I saw it, I was 13, 14 when it came out. I'd only seen the last half of the Wellman film and nothing else up to that point. And so I didn't have any preconceived notions about what was changed. I mean, I'd read the book and I knew that, but I've always felt that it would be more highly esteemed if they'd given it a different name and just hadn't bothered trying to, because Hayes, for whatever reason, seemed to take it as a mandate that he would just change everything that made it specifically Beau Geste, except the propping up the bodies. But even all the mystery, he stripped away from it right away. Because, in the book and in the first two films, the relief column comes, all the Arabs are gone, there are no dead bodies. It's just this serene, eerie place. And they eventually learn that all the men are dead inside. But, in the Hayes film, they come riding up and there are dead Arabs everywhere. And the fort is burning, but not because of a Viking's funeral, because they just threw firebombs during the battle and so forth.
You may find this hard to understand. Those men died as traitors. But they would have been heroes if there'd been no mutiny. The Legion needs heroes. So, there was no mutiny.
Depending on which of us is left to tell the story.
Then you do understand.
I thought it just seemed pointlessly changed for no apparent reason except that he seemed to just have some kind of contempt for the original thing. I wrote to his son numerous times over the course of, I'd say, 15 years, saying, is there any production material on this? Universal has nothing on it. They have pictures, they have stills and so forth. But in terms of production material, nothing at all. So, whereas on the 1926 film, I can tell you pretty much every single day of production where they were and what they were shooting, because I had access to the production files in the Paramount collection at the Herrick Library. Same thing with the Wellman film. A little less detailed, but still could put it together pretty well. But this, the only thing that's lucky for me was that the Yuma Sun newspaper were on set pretty much every day. And so at least when they were on the location, which wasn't as long as you would think they would be, the Sun was there and you could get a good idea of what they were shooting. But then they had the fort built on a soundstage at Universal as well. And the great majority of the film is shot on that stage. So you could see that, I first just saw it, that you could see the top half of the tower when they're on location, but you only see the bottom half of the tower where on the stage. Whereas in the Wellman film, you have this great fall, this wonderful fall from the tower. It goes all the way down to the floor of the parapet there. But in the 66 version, it's always somebody falls off the tower, cut, somebody hits the floor. So,
yeah. What was the most difficult thing to research?
Hands down, Australian radio. Of course, I knew nothing about any of it. And there's a ton of it. Not only Beau Geste, but Beau Sabreur and Beau Ideal, and also The Wages of Virtue, which was the first P.C. Wren novel that was filmed with Gloria Swanson. They made dramas out of all of these things, serials out of all of those. And
what time frame was this?
It starts in the early 30s and it goes to the early 50s. And the only way I could gather any kind of form on it was to go through Australian radio magazines and newspapers and check the listings every day and keep a record. So for this chapter, which no human on earth will ever read, and I will put money on that, I spent 4 solid months gathering that material together.
Wow.
So it will never be appreciated by any human on earth, but man, oh man, it's rare stuff.
Well, I don't know. I got to figure there's some PC Wren fans down in Australia, or they wouldn't have done the radio stuff. So there might be somebody there that's just going to eat it up.
Yeah, well, I'm still waiting for an Australian book sale, so we'll see.
All right. Well, what would you say was the most rewarding discovery during the course of doing the book?
I think the most rewarding chapter to write was for the 1982 British miniseries, the BBC miniseries. And that was because I came to that chapter with minor knowledge. I had a couple of articles from the time. The Radio Times had a cover story on it in 82, and I had that and a couple of other things, but I really had very little. But I met some incredible people. One of them was a man named Michael Seeley, who wrote a biography of Douglas Camfield, who directed it. And of course, Doctor Who people know him as a major Doctor Who director, but he was obsessed with Beau Geste for his entire life. And this was like dream come true. He also died very young, I think he was like 51 or so when he passed away. So Seeley, in turn, very generous man, and he in turn introduced me to the production designer. And I mostly dealt with his wife through emails and so forth, because I think that the production designer was not particularly well at the time. And I think he just let his wife do all the time. But she was a delightful woman. And because I love process shots, I love shots of forts being built, of models that they worked with and so forth. And so I wrote to her and said, do you happen to have a photo of your husband's model that he made for Fort Zinderneuf? And a couple of days later, I would say 40 pictures came in, not only showing the model in various ways and in various forms, but of the fort being built. I mean, I have a photo of the fort when it's nothing but metal framework. And then, when it's been cladded with board, and then when the stucco and everything starts coming up, go right through this whole thing. And then there's this also wonderful guy named Philip Fairweather, who is the great grandson of P.C. Wren. And his grandfather, Alan Graham Smith, was invited onto the set. So the son, or the stepson, to be specific, the son of P.C. Wren went to the set and took all these pictures. And Philip, who lives partly in England and partly in Poland, mentioned, he said, I have all my grandfather's pictures. Would you like to see them? So again, as I always do, leave me alone. I don't want to see stuff like that. He said just remarkable things. And the pictures, he's not unlike when my dad took pictures. It was a terrible photographer. So there's kind of iffy focus and so forth. Nevertheless, it's the son of P.C. Wren taking pictures of Beau Geste. And so in that case, I took many of the best pictures and made a fake photo album so that I could clearly place it as being the amateur snapshots, but because of who took them, very important stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like stuff like this came constantly, all this wonderful stuff. And similarly, at about the same time, a man named Roger Elsgood, who produced the 1994 radio, BBC did 5 or 6 radio serials of Beau Geste, but this is the most recent one up to now, or was it 2004? I can't remember. It's too much to remember. But I interviewed him by phone, and he said, look, I got some production stuff on this film, and I'll send it to you if you want it. So he sent me many, many, many pages of production material where everything was recorded. There were 3 different houses or buildings they went to for various reasons because of sound quality and so forth. And sent me recording logs, sent me some recording logs of the score being recorded and what instruments were there and so forth. Just all of this was in the last 6 or 8 months of writing the book. After working on it for nearly 3 years already, suddenly this flood of amazing things started to come in, Like Lou Gehrig, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Well, listen, as we draw things down here, I want to ask you my standard question for my guests, which is, what is your most memorable movie-going experience?
That is a surprisingly easy one to answer. And I have several really important ones, but this one, when in 2012, when we went to Oakland and saw Kevin Brownlow's restoration of Napoleon, I'd seen it years earlier in the 80s, and this was a good 2 hours longer, 70-piece orchestra playing Carl Davis's score, full-size triptych for the climax of the film. And it really took all day because there were long intermissions and even like an hour and a half lunch break. So, we got out of there at probably 11 o'clock that night. And I said to my wife, if they showed it again right now, I would sit down and watch it again. It was astonishing. I don't know that I'll ever have a movie experience that will ever match that.
Yeah, that sounds pretty amazing. Yeah, I saw the version that came out in the 80s, and I only saw the fuller restoration relatively recently when I got the Blu-ray a few months ago. So it's quite a film even in that type of viewing, but for the full experience, the orchestra and everything, that must have been really really awesome. So now, I mentioned at the beginning that you've written a lot of books, and I know there are some others that I'm going to want to come back and do episodes with you on. What have you got? What have you got on the fire right now?
I'm scaling back because the last 2 books have been so mammoth. I live in North Carolina now. We moved here 8 years ago, I guess, and I love location stuff, and so my plan is I'm going to do a series of books on various aspects of silent filmmaking in North Carolina. And then I'll move I'm probably going to do a book early on about Thunder Road with the Robert Mitchum film, which was filmed here in Asheville. And there's still a surprising amount of things that you can see that were in the film, although it was made in 1957. So things change and some things don't. But
sure.
And so I'm going to be doing. I have a tentative schedule of approximately 20 books, but they will all be in the range of 100 to 120 pages, something like that. So not like this stuff, which will kill you.
Well, it's certainly a very impressive and amazing work that you've got here, and thank you for joining me to talk about it. For the listeners, again, my guest is Frank Thompson. We've been talking about his massive phone book, The Compleat Beau Geste. I highly recommend it if you have any affection for the film at all. You absolutely want to get it. And one thing we didn't touch on just in passing is, from what I understand, there is a restoration of the 1926 silent version with Ronald Colman currently in the works. It may just be in the fundraising stage at this point. I'm not really sure, but I've seen references to it. So that would be something really nice to see.
My lips are sealed.
Well, okay. We have ways of making you talk.
Man, wouldn't that be great? There's for years, people have been saying that it's in good shape and but it's not in good shape. And a restoration of that would be miraculous. And so let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, once again, Frank, thank you for joining me on Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thank you. Well, fun.
And thanks again to you listeners. Once again, don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button and leave a rating where you listen, as well as a review if possible. Also, swing by the Movie Nights and Matinees website to leave a comment and to check out the multiple items available to purchase that will provide a bit of financial support for the podcast.
All right, open that screen.
A movie? We've just seen one. You gotta show a movie to party. It's a Hollywood law.